A lot of the xenophobia is economically related because what happens is you live in South Africa.
Right.
He lives in Namibia, hypothetically.
It's the classes you mean?
No, stay with me.
Yeah.
So you are boycotting your job because y'all want higher pay. So they come to Namibia and tell you, get me 100 Namibians, come to South Africa. We need y'all to break this protest. You hungry. You got kids to feed, so guess what you do? You come across national lines and you break the South African protest. Now you just gave birth to that xenophobia. Why would you bring a black ass to my country and sabotage my fight for better pay? You see that?
Okay.
So a lot of the xenophobia in Africa is economically related. It's the white man, again, putting black people against black people. It's the same thing they do over here with us. It's no
Apartness
different.
in the language of Africans was a system of legislation that upheld segregation against non-whites of South Africa. After the National Party gained power in South Africa in 1948, its all-white government immediately began enforcing existing policies of racial segregation. Under apartheid, non-white South Africans who formed the majority of the population were forced to live in separate areas from whites and use separate public facilities. Contacts were limited between the two groups despite consistent and strong opposition to apartheid within and outside South Africa. Its laws remained in effect for the better part of 50 years. Hello everyone. Welcome to the New World Affairs. Did apartheid define black South African differently from other Africans? From 1948 through the 1990s, a single word dominated life in South Africa. Apartheid, from an African word meaning apartness, defined as a set of laws enacted in South Africa in 1948, intended to ensure the strict racial segregation of South African society and the dominance of the Africans speaking white. Apartheid was in practice enforced in the form which required racial segregation of public facilities and social gatherings, and another form which required racial segregation in government, housing, and employment. The white minority who controlled the apartheid government were Afrikaans, descendants of mostly Dutch colonists who had invaded South Africa from the 17th century. Although Afrikaner oppression of black South Africans predate the formal establishment of apartheid in 1948, the apartheid government used violence to enforce segregation between whites, black South Africans, colored and Indians, and forcibly separated many families containing people assigned to different racial categories. Apartheid legalized and enforced a specific racial ideology that separated South Africans into legally distinct groups. The system was rooted in the country's history of colonization and slavery. The white settlers had historically viewed black South Africans as a natural resource to be used to turn the country from a rural society to an industrialized one. Dutch settlers relied on slaves to build up South Africa, starting from the 17th century. Gold and diamonds were discovered just around the time slavery was abolished in the country in 1863. That discovery became a lucrative opportunity for white-owned mining companies that employed and exploited black workers. Like Dutch slaveholders, they relied on intimidation and discrimination to rule over their black workers. The earlier slaveholders' and British settlers' tactics were imitated by mining companies to control black workers. These laws, called pass laws, required members of the black majority and other people of color to carry identification papers at all times, and also restricted their movement in certain areas. Between 1960 and 1983, over 3.5 million non-white South Africans were removed from their homes and forcibly relocated into racially segregated neighborhoods. Especially among the colored and Indian mixed race groups, many family members were forced to live in widely separated neighborhoods. Early resistance to the apartheid laws resulted in the enactment of further restrictions, including the banning of the influential African National Congress, a political party known for spearheading the anti-apartheid movement. Black South African opposition to apartheid intensified after the white minority-ruled Nationalist Party assumed power in 1948. They enacted laws that effectively banned all legal and non-violent forms of protest by non-white South Africans. In 1960, the Nationalist Party outlawed both the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, both of which advocated for a national government controlled by the black majority. Many leaders of the ANC and PAC were imprisoned, including ANC leader Nelson Mandela, who had become a symbol of the anti-apartheid movement. With Mandela in prison, other anti-apartheid leaders fled South Africa and mustered followers in neighbouring Mozambique and other supportive African countries, including Guinea, Tanzania and Zambia. U.S. foreign policy, which had first helped apartheid flourish, underwent a total transformation and eventually played an important part in its downfall. With Cold War just heating up and the American people in the mood for isolationism, President Harry Truman's main foreign policy goal was to limit the expansion of the Soviet Union's influence. While Truman's domestic policy supported the advancement of the civil rights of black people in the United States, his administration chose not to protest the anti-communist South African white-ruled government system of apartheid. Influenced to an extent by the growing U.S. civil rights movement and the social equality laws enacted as part of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society platform, U.S. government leaders began to warm up to and ultimately support the anti-apartheid cause. Finally, in 1986, the U.S. Congress, overriding President Ronald Reagan's veto, enacted the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, imposing the first substantial economic sanctions to be levied against South Africa for its practice of social apartheid. The rest of the world began to object to the brutality of the South African apartheid regime in 1960. After white South African police opened fire on unarmed black protesters in the town of Sharpeville, killing 69 people and wounding 186 others. The UN proposed economic sanctions against the white, ruled South African government. Not wanting to lose allies in Africa, several powerful members of the UN Security Council, including Great Britain, France, and the US, succeeded in watering down the sanctions. The sanctions imposed by the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1986, drove many large multinational companies along with their money and jobs out of South Africa. As a result, holding on to apartheid brought the white-controlled South African state significant losses in revenue, security, and international reputation. Supporters of apartheid, both in South Africa and in many Western countries, had touted it as a defense against communism. That defense lost steam when the Cold War ended in 1991. Facing a rising tide of protest within his own country and the international condemnation of apartheid South Africa Prime Minister P.W. Botha lost the support of the ruling National Party and resigned in 1989. Botha's successor, F.W. de Klerk, amazed observers by lifting the ban on the African National Congress and the other black liberation parties, restoring freedom of the press and releasing political prisoners. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked free after 27 years in prison. A new constitution that enfranchised black South African and other racial groups took effect in 1994, and elections that year led to a coalition government with a non-white majority, marking the official end of the apartheid system. Post-apartheid did not end all of South Africa's economic and socially entrenched issues, as such issues have existed way before migrant influx into the country. The post-apartheid government repealed the Group Areas Act, but the ANC government faltered on desegregation. While housing has improved for many people, 14% of the population still lives in informal settlements. Targets for housing construction have not been met, and long backlogs have grown from an estimated 1.5 million units in 1994 to almost 3 million as of now. Activists such as Western Cape Anti-Eviction Campaign empower squatters to fight evictions in court, demand services such as electricity and water, and agitate for the construction of more housing for migrant needs as well. Crime and safety in South Africa have a profoundly complicated history. To undergird apartheid, white South Africans frequently accused black South Africans of criminality. Apologists for the apartheid government pointed to the sudden rise in homicides and property crime in 1994, stating that the government could not rule. South Africa is home to the largest private security sector in the world, and its roots can be traced to apartheid, as white South Africans saw themselves as more exposed to crime. A series of laws in the 1980s saw the growth of private security firms as the police increasingly tried and failed to maintain order in townships. In this respect, some aspects of crime and policing haven't changed much since the end of apartheid. State violence to maintain order and enforce labor demands haven't disappeared. In 2012, Ramaphosa, before becoming president, encouraged police to end a wildcat strike at the Marikana mine. Police subsequently killed 34 striking miners in a shooting, the bloodiest use of force by police since the Soweto uprising in 1976. Does xenophobia tell the full story of migration in South Africa? Whilst the realities of xenophobic violence cannot be dismissed, peaceful and mutually beneficial relationships between South Africans and migrants from other African countries do regularly exist. The anti-migrant sentiment stems largely from South Africa's dire economic situation amid its corrupt government. As some black South Africans may accuse migrants of taking jobs from locals amid increasing poverty and scarcity of resources, studies indicate for every 2 jobs created by a migrant, 4 South Africans were able to find employment. Although hostility against migrants has been marshaled by organized groups such as Operation Doodle and the political party Put South Africa First, these anti-migrant movements have been decried as vigilant-type organizations. An anthropological study of migrants in Giyani, a town in the northeastern part of Limpopo province, revealed how Zimbabweans who settled in the area developed their social relationships within it. The friendship and conviviality between Shona migrants from Zimbabwe and the Xitsonga-speaking South Africans living in Giyani are much to be desired. Such networks are used to avoid both physical and xenophobic attacks as they afford migrants that level of belonging and protection. South Africa has come a long way from a white minority ruled to a black majority ruled as a result of a long road of apartheid. Every effort to undermine the struggle of the freedom fighters would be interpreted as xenophobic. More and more other Africans continue to make South Africa their home, flourishing and coexisting.